Chapter 28. Evacuation of Petersburg. Petersburg, the cockade city, was scarcely less noted than Richmond itself for its high military spirit, its devotion to the Confederacy, and the extent of its sacrifices for the Southern cause. There was scarcely a home within its corporate limits that was not open to the sick and wounded of Lee's army. Its patriotic citizens denied themselves all luxuries and almost actual necessaries in order to feed and strengthen the hungry fighters in the trenches. Its women, who were noted for culture and refinement, became nurses, as consecrated as Florence Nightingale, as they soothed the sufferings and strengthened the hopes of the dying soldiers. Now and then, in the experiences of the young people, the subtle radiance of romance lighted up the gloom of the hospitals. A beautiful Southern girl, on her daily mission of love and mercy, asked a badly wounded soldier boy what she could do for him. He replied, "I'm greatly obliged to you, but it is too late for you to do anything for me. I am so badly shot that I can't live long. Will you not let me pray for you? I hope that I am one of the Lord's daughters, and I would like to ask him to help you." Looking intently into her bewitching face, he replied, "Yes, pray at once, and ask the Lord to let me be his son-in-law." The susceptible young soldier had evidently received, at this interview, another wound, which served to convert his apprehensions of death into a longing for domestic life. During the 2 weeks following the sudden seizure of Fort Stedman and its equally sudden release, my legs were rarely out of my long boots. For 8 days the shifting scenes and threatening demonstrations on my front, and in front of A.P. Hill on my right, kept me on horseback until my tired limbs and aching joints made a constant appeal for rest. The coming of night brought little or no cessation of the perplexing and fatiguing activities. Night after night troops were marching, heavy guns were roaring, picket lines were driven in and had to be re-established, and the great mortars from both Union and Confederate works were hurling high in the air their ponderous shells which crossed each other's paths, and, with burning fuses, like tails of flying comets, descended in meteoric showers on the opposing entrenchments. The breastworks protecting the battle lines were so high and broad that the ordinary cannonballs and shells could not penetrate them and reach the soldiers who stood behind them. In order, therefore, to throw shells into the ranks of the opposing army, these mortars were introduced. They were short, big-mouthed cannon, and were pointed upward, but leaning slightly toward the enemy's lines, and their great shells were hurled skyward, and then came whirling down, exploding with terrific force among the men who stood or slept behind the breastworks. At a point near where the left of A.P. Hill's corps touched the right of mine, a threatened attack brought together for council a number of officers from each of these commands. After this conference as to the proper disposition of troops for resisting the expected assault, we withdrew into a small log hut standing near, and united in prayer to Almighty God for his guidance. As we assembled, one of our generals was riding within hailing distance, and General Harry Heth of Hill's corps stepped to the door of the log cabin and called to him to come in and unite with us in prayer. The officer did not understand the nature of General Heth's invitation, and replied, "No, thank you, General. No more at present. I've just had some." This amusing incident, while it convulsed the small assemblage with laughter, did not delay many moments the earnest petitions for deliverance. From the commander-in-chief to the privates in the ranks, there was a deep and sincere religious feeling in Lee's army. Whenever it was convenient or practicable, these hungry but unyielding men were holding prayer meetings. Their supplications were fervent and often inspiring, but now and then there were irresistibly amusing touches. At one of these gatherings for prayer was a private who had lost one leg. Unable to kneel, he sat with bowed head, while one of his comrades, whom we shall call Brother Jones, led in prayer. Brother Jones was earnestly praying for more manhood, more strength, and more courage. The brave old one-legged Confederate did not like Brother Jones's prayer. At that period of the war, he felt that it was almost absurd to be asking God to give the Confederates more courage, of which virtue they already had an abundant supply. So he called out from his seat, "Hold on there, Brother Jones. Don't you know you are praying all wrong? Why don't you pray for more provisions? We've got more courage now than we have any use for." This did not occur in my immediate camp, but a similar incident did. In a meeting for prayer near my headquarters, there was more than the usual impressiveness, more of that peculiar sadness which is significant of brave despair. As in all the religious gatherings in the army, all denominations of Christians were represented. The chaplain who conducted the solemn services asked a number of officers and others to lead in prayer. Among them he called upon a private who belonged to my sharpshooters and who had not had the advantages of an early education. This consecrated soldier knelt close by my side, and with his heart all aglow with the spirit of the meeting and his mind filled with strong convictions as to the justice of our cause, he said in a clear, ringing voice, "O Lord, we are having a mighty big fight down here, and a sight of trouble, and we do hope, Lord, that you will take a proper view of this subject and give us the victory." As for himself, he had no doubt as to what a proper view of the great conflict was. None of them had. While they fully comprehended the situation from an earthly or purely military point of view, they hoped to the last that by some miraculous intervention the proper view of the subject would ultimately prevail. The General-in-Chief and his corps commanders were kept fairly well advised by our scouts as to General Grant's preparations and movements, but, independent of this direct intelligence, there were other indications which could not be misunderstood. The roads were wet, and hence no clouds of dust rose above the treetops to tell us during the day of Grant's progress. But at night his campfires in the pines painted a light on the horizon near us, which admonished us that he was marching around our right to seize the South Side Railroad and force us out of our trenches. Sheridan's large bodies of cavalry, supported by infantry, soon appeared in the neighbourhood of Five Forks, a point from which roads led in 5 directions. It was a strategic point of such importance to Lee, for either the continued defence of Petersburg or the withdrawal of his army, that he determined to hold it until surrender was inevitable. He, therefore, adopted the same bold, aggressive policy which had so repeatedly thwarted the flank movements of his great antagonist on every battlefield from the Wilderness to Petersburg. Withdrawing all the troops that could be spared from the trenches, Lee hurled his depleted but still resolute little army against Grant's heavy lines of infantry on the march to Five Forks, and drove back in confusion that portion of the Federal army. But the small Confederate force there employed was utterly inadequate either to press the temporary advantage or to hold the position it had won. It was quickly swept from the front of the overpowering Federals, and the concentration upon Five Forks was accomplished. The small force of Confederates which defended it fought with characteristic courage. In the first encounter, General Sheridan's forces were repelled from the breastworks, but soon the devoted little band of Grey was torn by artillery, harried by cavalry, and assaulted by infantry on every side, and the Confederate flags went down, while their brave defenders were surrounded by a cordon of fire. Five Forks fell, with the loss of large numbers of Confederates in killed, wounded, and prisoners. Turning from Five Forks in the direction of Petersburg, the victorious Federals came upon the flank and rear of the defensive works around the city. Longstreet's corps had been ordered from the lines around Richmond, but came too late to prevent the disaster at Five Forks. It was not too late, however, to check the flanking force of Federals marching upon the city from that direction. A part of A.P. Hill's corps was formed at right angles to the trenches and shared in the furious fighting. That brilliant corps commander and devoted patriot, whose name was the synonym of chivalry, gave his life to the cause he loved in these last dark hours of the expiring Confederacy. As General Lee rode back toward Petersburg from Five Forks, near which he had led in person a brilliant and successful charge, he said to one of his aides, "This is a sad business, Colonel." In a few minutes he added, "It has happened as I told them in Richmond it would happen. The line has been stretched until it is broken." On this melancholy ride, the shattered and ragged remnants of his army, still proud, hopeful, and defiant, saluted him at every point with shouts of welcome, indicating their undiminished admiration and confidence. This was the first day of April. Not one day of rest had been given these starving men to recover from the winter's trials and sufferings, which have been so truthfully described by the graphic pen of Dr. Henry Alexander White. Winter poured down its snows and its sleets upon Lee's shelterless men in the trenches. Some of them burrowed into the earth. Most of them shivered over the feeble fires kept burning along the lines. Scanty and thin were the garments of these heroes. Most of them were clad in mere rags. Gaunt famine oppressed them every hour. 1/4 pound of rancid bacon and a little meal was the daily portion assigned to each man by the rules of the War Department. But even this allowance failed when the railroads broke down and left the bacon and the flour and the meal piled up beside the tracks in Georgia and the Carolinas. 1/6 of this daily ration was the allotment for a considerable time, and very often the supply of bacon failed entirely. With dauntless hearts, these gaunt-faced men endured the almost ceaseless fire of Grant's mortar batteries. The frozen fingers of Lee's army of sharpshooters clutched the musket barrel with an aim so steady that Grant's men scarcely ever lifted their heads from their bomb-proofs. These men, less than 40,000 in number, had held for many months a battle line 40 miles long, stretching from the Chickahominy to Hatcher's Run. My own cause was stretched until the men stood like a row of vedettes, 15 feet apart, in the trenches. Portions of my line, it was not a line. It was the mere skeleton of a line had been broken by assaults at daybreak on April 2nd. There were no troops, not a man in reserve to help us, but no extremity appalled my grim and gaunt-visaged fighters. At the command, they assembled at double quick in more compact lines around those points which had been seized and were still held by the Federals, densely packed in the captured entrenchments. By desperate charges, one after another of these breaches in my line was restored, until but one remained in possession of the enemy. I was in the act of concentrating for a supreme effort to restore this last breach, when Colonel Charles Marshall of General Lee's staff reached me with a message from the Commander-in-Chief. It was to admonish me of the dire disaster at Five Forks on the extreme right flank of our army, of the approach of the triumphant and overwhelming Union forces in rear of our defences, of the forced abandonment by A.P. Hill of his works, and of the death of that superb officer. In the face of this almost complete crushing of every command defending the entire length of our lines on my right, the restoration of the remaining breach in my front could contribute nothing toward the rescue of Lee's army. He therefore directed that I sacrifice no more men in the effort to recover entire control of my works, but that I maintain my compact line around this last breach, prevent, if possible, Grant's effort to send through it his forces into the city, and at any sacrifice hold my position until night and until all the other commands could be withdrawn. When this withdrawal had been accomplished, my command was to silently evacuate Petersburg and cover the retreat of Lee's brave but shattered little army. The indomitable spirit of my men was never more strikingly shown than in their cheerful response to this command. I feel constrained at this point to place upon record the fact that these were the same men who scarcely 1 week before had made the daring plunge in the darkness which resulted in the capture of Fort Stedman and its flanking lines. The same men who on the first day at Gettysburg had turned the tide of battle, who at sunset on the 6th of May in the Wilderness had carried dismay to the right flank of the Federal Army, who at Spotsylvania had made the furious countercharge under the eye of Lee, who at Cedar Creek had rushed upon Sheridan's left with resistless momentum, and to whom I have endeavoured to do but simple justice in my account of the oscillating fortunes of the two armies on that field. They were the men whose record will brighten for all time every page of the history of that immortal army which a knightly and able Federal soldier has pronounced the best which has existed on this continent. In a paper read before the Military Historical Society of Massachusetts, General Charles A. Whittier of the Union Army says, "The Army of Northern Virginia will deservedly rank as the best which has existed on this continent." Suffering privations unknown to its opponents, It fought well from the early Peninsular days to the surrender of that small remnant at Appomattox. It seemed always ready, active, mobile. Without doubt it was composed of the best men of the South, rushing to what they considered the defence of their country against a bitter invader. And they took the places assigned them, officer or private, and fought until beaten by superiority of numbers. The North sent no such army to the field, and its patriotism was of easier character, etc. In the same historical paper, General Whittier says, "As a matter of comparison, we have lately read that from William and Mary College, Virginia, 32 out of 35 professors and instructors abandoned the college work and joined the army in the field. Harvard College sent one professor from its large corps of professors and instructors. In every southern state, the universities and colleges sent to the front their students and the flower of their alumni as volunteers. It is stated that 9/10 of the students of the University of Virginia enlisted for the war. In the Rockbridge Battery there were 7 Masters of Arts of the university, 28 college graduates and 25 theological students. Among these privates was R. E. Lee, Jr., son of the great commander. On my staff as volunteer aide was Professor Basil A. Gildersleeve of the University of Virginia, now of Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Gildersleeve has no superior in the country as a Greek scholar, and is one of the most distinguished of our classical writers. He was a most efficient officer, and exhibited in extreme peril a high order of courage and composure. While bearing an order in battle, he was desperately wounded and maimed for life. These and many similar facts which could be given demonstrate the justice of General Whittier's estimate. General Grant, in this last movement upon our lines at Petersburg, hurled against us his army of 124,000 brave and superbly equipped soldiers. To resist them, General Lee could then bring into line about 35,000 worn and wan but consecrated fighters. Possibly one half of these had been, on the 1st and 2nd of April, killed, wounded, and captured, or the commands to which they belonged had been so broken to pieces as to eliminate them from the effective forces. There was no hope for us except in retreat. Under orders from the General-in-Chief, the old corps of Stonewall Jackson, which it was my privilege to command, was the last of his army to abandon forever those mortar-battered lines of defence around Petersburg. After the hour of midnight, when all other troops were safely on the march to the rear, the Second Army Corps silently and sadly withdrew from the blood-stained trenches in which Lee's peerless army had exhibited for 9 weary months a patience in suffering, a steadfastness under discouraging conditions, and a strength in resistance unexampled in war. As the last broken file of that matchless army stepped from the bridge and my pioneer corps lighted the flames that consumed it, there came to me a vivid and depressing realization of the meaning of the appalling tragedy of the last 2 days. The breaking of Lee's power had shattered the last hope of Southern independence. But another burden, a personal woe, was weighing upon me. I had left behind me in that city of gloom the wife who had followed me during the entire war. She was ill. But as I rode away from Petersburg during the dismal hours of that night, I found comfort in the hope that some chivalric soldier of the Union Army would learn of her presence and guard her home against all intruders. My confidence in American manhood was not misplaced. To bring up the rear and adequately protect the retreating army was an impossible task. With characteristic vigour, General Grant pressed the pursuit. Soon began the continuous and final battle. Fighting all day, marching all night, with exhaustion and hunger claiming their victims at every mile of the march, with charges of infantry in rear and of cavalry on the flanks, it seemed the war god had turned loose all his furies to revel in havoc. On and on, hour after hour, from hilltop to hilltop, the lines were alternately forming, fighting and retreating, making one almost continuous shifting battle. Here, in one direction, a battery of artillery became involved. There, in another, a blocked ammunition train required rescue. And thus came short but sharp little battles which made up the side shows of the main performance, while the different divisions of Lee's lion-hearted army were being broken and scattered or captured. Out of one of these whirlwinds there came running at the top of his speed a boy soldier whose wit flashed out even in that dire extremity. When asked why he was running, he shouted back, "Golly, Captain, I'm running 'cause I can't fly." On the night of the 6th of April, 3 days before the final surrender, my superb scout, young George of Virginia, who recently died in Danville, greatly honoured and loved by his people, brought to me under guard 2 soldiers dressed in full Confederate uniform, whom he had arrested on suspicion, believing that they belonged to the enemy. About 2 months prior to this arrest, I had sent George out of Petersburg on a most perilous mission. All of his scouting was full of peril. I directed him to go in the rear of General Grant's lines, to get as close as he could to the general's headquarters, and, if possible, catch someone with dispatches, or in some way bring me reliable information as to what was being done by the Union commander. George was remarkably conscientious, intelligent, and accurate in his reports. He always wore his Confederate grey jacket, which would protect him from the penalty of death as a spy if he should be captured. But he also wore, when on his scouting expeditions, a pale blue overcoat captured from the Union Army. A great many of our soldiers wore these overcoats because they had no others. On this particular expedition, George was hiding in the woods not far from General Grant's headquarters when he saw passing near him 2 men in Confederate uniform. It was late in the evening, nearly dark. He at once made himself known to them, supposing that they were scouting for some other corps in Lee's army. But they were Sheridan's men, belonging to his Jesse Scouts, and they instantly drew their revolvers upon George and marched him to General Grant's headquarters. He was closely questioned by the Union commander, but he was too intelligent to make any mistakes in his answers. He showed his grey jacket, which saved him from execution as a spy, and he was placed in the guardhouse. His opportunity for escape came late one night, when he found a new recruit on guard at his prison door. This newly enlisted soldier was a foreigner, and had very little knowledge of the English language, but he knew what a $20 gold piece was. The Confederacy did not have much gold, but our scouts were kept supplied with it. George pulled out of the lining of his jacket the gold piece, placed it in the foreigner's hand, turned the fellow's back to the door, and walked quickly out of the guardhouse. George would not have dared to attempt such a program with an American on guard. He reached our lines and reported these details only a few days before our last retreat was begun. During that retreat on the night of April 6, 1865, as I rode among my men, he brought 2 soldiers under guard to me and said, "General, here are 2 men who are wearing our uniforms and say they belong to Fitzhugh Lee's cavalry, but I believe they are Yankees. I had them placed under guard for you to examine." I questioned the men closely and could find no sufficient ground for George's suspicions. They seemed entirely self-possessed and at ease under my rigid examination. They gave me the names of Fitzhugh Lee's regimental and company commanders, said they belonged to a certain mess, and gave the names of the members, and without a moment's hesitation gave prompt answer to every question I asked. I said to George that they seemed to me all right, but he protested, saying, "No, General, they are not all right. I saw them by the starlight counting your files." One of them at once said, "Yes, we were trying to get some idea of your force. We have been at home on sick leave for a long time, and wanted to know if we had any army left." This struck me as a little suspicious, and I pounded them again with questions. "You say that you have been home on sick leave?" "Yes, sir. We have been at home several weeks, and fell in with your command tonight, hoping that you could tell us how to get to General Fitzhugh Lee's cavalry." "If you have been at home sick, you ought to have your furloughs with you." "We have, sir. We have our furlough papers here in our pockets, signed by our own officers and approved by General B.E. Lee. If we had a light, you could examine them and see that they are all right." George, who was listening to this conversation, which occurred while we were riding, again insisted that it did not matter what these men said or what they had. They were Yankees. I directed that they be brought on under guard until I could examine their papers. We soon came to a burning log heap on the roadside, which had been kindled by some of the troops who had passed at an earlier hour of the night. The moment the full light fell upon their faces, George exclaimed, "General, these are the 2 men who captured me nearly 2 months ago behind General Grant's headquarters." They ridiculed the suggestion, and at once drew from their pockets the furloughs. These papers seemed to be correct, and the signatures of the officers, including that of General Lee, seemed to be genuine. This evidence did not yet satisfy George nor shake his convictions. He said that the signatures of our officers were forged, or these men had captured some of our men who had furloughs and had taken the papers from them and were now personating the real owners. He asked me to make them dismount, that he might go through them, as he described his proposed search. He fingered every seam in their coats, took off their cavalry sabres, and searched their garments, but found nothing. At last he asked me to make them sit down and let him pull off their boots. One personated a Confederate private, the other wore the uniform of a lieutenant of cavalry. George drew the boots from the lieutenant's feet, and under the lining of one he found an order from General Grant to General Ord, directing the latter to move rapidly by certain roads and cut off Lee's retreat at Appomattox. As soon as this order was found, the young soldier admitted the truth of George's statement that they were the 2 men who captured him behind Grant's lines. I said to them, "Well, you know your fate. Under the laws of war, you have forfeited your lives by wearing this uniform, and I shall have you shot at sunrise tomorrow morning." They received this announcement without the slightest appearance of nervousness. The elder could not have been more than 19 or 20 years of age, while his companion was a beardless youth. One of them said with perfect composure, "General, we understand it all. We knew when we entered this kind of service and put on these uniforms that we were taking our lives in our hands, and that we should be executed if we were captured. You have the right to have us shot, but the war can't last much longer, and it would do you no good to have us killed." I had no thought of having them executed, but I did not tell them so. I sent the captured order to General Lee, and at 4 o'clock on the morning of the 7th he wrote me in pencil a note which was preserved by my Chief of Staff, Major R. W. Hunter, now of Alexandria, Virginia. It was sent, a few years ago, to Mrs. Gordon, to be kept by her as a memento of this most remarkable incident. Unhappily, it was lost in the fire which in 1899 consumed my home. In that brief note, General Lee directed me to march by certain roads toward Appomattox as rapidly as the physical condition of my men would permit. Thus, by General Lee's direction, my command was thrown to the front that we might thwart, if possible, the purpose of the Union commander to check at Appomattox our retrograde movement. General Lee approved my suggestion to spare the lives of Sheridan's captured Jesse scouts, and directed me to bring them along with my command. This incident closed with my delivery of the young soldiers to General Sheridan on the morning of Lee's surrender. Chapter 29. The Surrender. Reaching the end of our journey, which terminated abruptly at the little village of Appomattox, the Army of Northern Virginia had become the mere skeleton of its former self. At Sailor's Creek, Anderson's corps was broken and destroyed, and General Ewell, with almost his entire command, was captured, as was General Kershaw, General Custis Lee, son of the General-in-Chief, and other prominent officers. I had discovered the movement threatening Ewell, and had sought to apprise him of his danger and to aid in his escape. But my own command was assailed at almost the same instant, and was precipitated into a short but strenuous battle for its own safety. The advance of Grant's army struck Ewell upon one road and my command upon another almost simultaneously. Rushing through the broad gap between Ewell and myself, the heavy Federal force soon surrounded the command of that brave old one-legged hero and forced him to surrender. Another Union column struck my command while we were endeavouring to push the ponderous wagon trains through the bog, out of which the starved teams were unable to drag them. Many of these wagons, loaded with ammunition, mired so deep in the mud that they had to be abandoned. It was necessary to charge and force back the Union lines in order to rescue my men from this perilous position. Indeed, not only was my command in almost incessant battle as we covered the retreat, but every portion of our marching column was being assailed by Grant's cavalry and infantry. The roads and fields and woods swarmed with eager pursuers, and Lee now and then was forced to halt his whole army, reduced to less than 10,000 fighters, in order to meet these simultaneous attacks. Various divisions along the line of march turned upon the Federals, and in each case checked them long enough for some other Confederate commands to move on. Mahone's infantry and Fitzhugh Lee's cavalry were engaged far in advance. The latter command captured General Gregg, who, with other prisoners, joined our retreat. I observed General Gregg marching on foot and asked him to accept a mount, as he was not accustomed to travelling as an infantry soldier. He expressed appreciation of the offer but declined, preferring to share the fate of his men. General Lee was riding everywhere and watching everything, encouraging his brave men by his calm and cheerful bearing. He was often exposed to great danger from shells and bullets, but in answer to protests, his reply was that he was obliged to see for himself what was going on. As he sat on his horse near Farmville during a sharp engagement, watching the effect of the fire from one of our batteries which was playing upon the enemy, a staff officer rode up to him with a message. The general noticed that this officer had exposed himself unnecessarily in approaching him, and he reprimanded the young soldier for not riding on the side of the hill where he would be protected from the enemy's fire. The young officer replied that he would be ashamed to seek protection while the commanding general was so exposing himself. General Lee sharply replied, "It is my duty to be here. Go back the way I told you, sir." Thus the great chieftain was teaching by example the lesson of devotion to duty at any risk, and teaching by precept that noblest of lessons, unselfish consideration for others. This was no new phase of his soldier life. It was not an exhibition of attributes developed by the trying conditions around him. It was simply a natural expression of the spirit that made him great and good. Many incidents in his army career illustrate the same elements of character. At some point below Richmond, he was standing near a battery when the men crowded around him, evidencing their admiration and affection. The group grew so large as to attract the enemy's attention and drew a heavy fire. Whereupon the general said to the privates around him, "Men, you had better go back to your places. They are firing at this point, and you are exposing yourselves to unnecessary danger." He remained there himself for some minutes, and then, as he walked quietly away, he picked up a small object and placed it on the limb of a tree. It was afterward ascertained that it was an unfledged sparrow that had fallen from its nest. In the wilderness, at Spotsylvania, and along the lines at Petersburg, he exposed himself whenever and wherever his presence seemed needful. The protests of his officers and soldiers against this habit were so frequent that he said on one occasion, half humorously, half complainingly, "I do wish somebody would tell me where my place is on the field of battle. Wherever I go to look after the fight, I am told, 'This is no place for you. You must go away.'" General Benjamin Butterworth of Ohio, Honest Ben, as he was familiarly called during his service as a member of Congress from the Buckeye State, gave me, after the war, an account of an incident occurring on this final retreat, which was both pathetic and amusing. It illustrates that remarkable and unique phase of the great struggle, the feeling of genuine comradeship, which existed between the soldiers of the hostile armies. On that doleful retreat of Lee's army, it was impossible for us to bury our dead or carry with us the disabled wounded. There was no longer any room in the crowded ambulances which had escaped capture and still accompanied our trains. We could do nothing for the unfortunate sufferers who were too severely wounded to march, except leave them on the roadside with canteens of water. A big-hearted soldier boy in blue came across a desperately wounded Confederate shot through legs and body, lying in his bloody bed of leaves, groaning with pain and sighing for relief in death. The generous Federal was so moved by the harrowing spectacle that he stopped at the side of the Confederate and asked, "What can I do for you, Johnny? I want to help you if I can." "Thank you for your sympathy," the sufferer replied, "but no one can help me now. It will not be long till death relieves me." The Union soldier bade him goodbye, and was in the act of leaving when the wounded Southerner called to him. "Yes, Yank, there is something you might do for me. You might pray for me before you go." This Union boy had probably never uttered aloud a word of prayer in all his life, but his emotions were deeply stirred, and through his tears he looked around for someone more accustomed to lead in prayer. Discovering some of his comrades passing, he called to them, "Come here, boys, and come quick. Here is a poor Johnny shot all to pieces, and he's dying. One of you must come and pray for him. He wants me to pray for him, but you know I can't pray, Werther." 2 days before the surrender, a number of officers held a council as to what was best to be done. I was not present, but I learned through others that 3 propositions were discussed. 1. To disband and allow the troops to get away as best they could, and reform at some designated point. This was abandoned because a dispersion over the country would be a dreadful infliction upon our impoverished people, and because it was most improbable that all the men would reach the rallying point. 2. To abandon all trains and concentrate the entire Confederate Army in a compact body and cut through Grant's lines. This proposition was in turn discarded because without ammunition trains we could not hope to continue the struggle many days. 3. To surrender at once. It was decided that this last course would be wisest, and these devoted officers felt that they should do all in their power to relieve General Lee by giving him their moral support in taking the step. General Grant had not then written his first note to Lee asking surrender. General Pendleton, who was the Confederate Chief of Artillery and a close personal friend of the commander, was selected by the council to acquaint him with the result of its deliberations. General Pendleton gave a most graphic description of his interview with General Lee. He said that the General-in-Chief instantly replied, "Oh no, I trust it has not come to that. We have too many bold men to think of laying down our arms." General Pendleton related that the general referred to the beginning of the Southern struggle for independence, and said, in substance, that he had never believed that, with the vast power against us, we could win our independence unless we were aided by foreign powers. "But," added General Lee, "such considerations really made no difference with me." And then he uttered those memorable words, "We had, I was satisfied, sacred principles to maintain and rights to defend, for which we were in duty bound to do our best, even if we perished in the endeavour." This great soldier understood the spirit which led the officers in that conference to recommend his surrender. He knew their devotion to the cause and their devotion to him, but he was not ready to consider the necessity for surrender. He doubtless had this conference in mind later when he perpetrated upon General Wise the joke which General Long has recorded. General Wise, in the absence of either basin or towel, had washed his face in a pool of water impregnated with red clay. The water dried, leaving the red stains on his countenance. General Lee was much amused at the grotesque appearance of Wise and saluted him as he approached. "Good morning, General Wise. I perceive that you, at any rate, have not given up the contest, as you are in your war paint this morning." In his report, written 3 days after the surrender and addressed to His Excellency Jefferson Davis, General Lee states that when we reached Appomattox, his army had been reduced to 2 corps under Longstreet and Gordon. He also says in that report, "On the morning of the 9th, according to the reports of the ordnance officers, there were 7892 organized infantry with arms." On the evening of April 8th, this little army, with its ammunition nearly exhausted, was confronted by the forces of General Grant, which had been thrown across our line of retreat at Appomattox. Then came the last sad Confederate council of war. It was called by Lee to meet at night. It met in the woods at his headquarters and by a low-burning bivouac fire. There was no tent there, no table, no chairs, and no camp stools. On blankets spread upon the ground or on saddles at the roots of the trees, we sat around the great commander. A painter's brush might transfer to canvas the physical features of that scene, but no tongue or pen will ever be able to describe the unutterable anguish of Lee's commanders as they looked into the clouded face of their beloved leader and sought to draw from it some ray of hope. There were present at this final council the General-in-Chief, the commander of his artillery, General Pendleton, General Fitzhugh Lee, who in the absence of Wade Hampton commanded the cavalry, and General Longstreet and myself, commanding all that was left of his immortal infantry. These fragments of each arm of the service still represented the consecration and courage that had made Lee's army, at the meridian of its power, almost invincible. The numbers and names of the staff officers who were present I cannot now recall, and it would be as impossible to give the words that were spoken or the suggestions that were made as it would to photograph the thoughts and emotions of that soldier group gathered at Lee's last bivouac. The letters of General Grant asking surrender and the replies thereto evoked a discussion as to the fate of the Southern people and the condition in which the failure of our cause would leave them. There was also some discussion as to the possibility of forcing a passage through Grant's lines and saving a small portion of the army, and continuing a desultory warfare until the government at Washington should grow weary and grant to our people peace and the safeguards of local self-government. If all that was said and felt at that meeting could be given, it would make a volume of measureless pathos. In no hour of the Great War did General Lee's masterful characteristics appear to me so conspicuous as they did in that last council. We knew by our own aching hearts that his was breaking. Yet he commanded himself and stood calmly facing and discussing the long-dreaded inevitable. It was finally determined that with Fitz-Lee's cavalry, my infantry, and Long's artillery, under Colonel Thomas H. Carter, we should attempt at daylight the next morning to cut through Grant's lines. Longstreet was to follow in support of the movement. The utmost that could be hoped for was that we might reach the mountains of Virginia and Tennessee with a remnant of the army and ultimately join General Johnston. As we rode away from the meeting, I directed a staff officer to return to General Lee and ask him if he had any specific directions as to where I should halt and camp for the night. He said, "Yes, tell General Gordon that I should be glad for him to halt just beyond the Tennessee line." That line was about 200 miles away, and Grant's battle lines and breastworks were in our immediate front, ready to check any movement in that direction. But General Lee knew that I would interpret his facetious message exactly as he intended it. His purpose was to let me infer that there was little hope of our escape, and that it did not matter where I camped for the night. But if we should succeed in cutting our way out, he expected me to press toward the goal in the mountains. The Federals had constructed a line of breastworks across our front during the night. The audacious movement of our troops was begun at dawn. The dashing cavalry leader, Fitzhugh Lee, swept around the Union left flank, while the infantry and artillery attacked the front. I take especial pride in recording the fact that this last charge of the war was made by the footsore and starving men of my command with a spirit worthy the best days of Lee's army. The Union breastworks were carried. 2 pieces of artillery were captured. The Federals were driven from all that portion of the field, and the brave boys in tattered grey cheered as their battle flags waved in triumph on that last morning. The Confederate battle lines were still advancing when I discovered a heavy column of Union infantry coming from the right and upon my rear. I gathered around me my sharpshooters, who were now held for such emergencies, and directed Colonel Thomas H. Carter of the artillery to turn all his guns upon the advancing column. It was held at bay by his shrapnel, grape, and canister. While the Confederate infantry and cavalry were thus fighting at the front, and the artillery was checking the development of Federal forces around my right and rear, Longstreet was assailed by other portions of the Federal army. He was so hardly pressed that he could not join, as contemplated, in the effort to break the cordon of men and metal around us. At this critical juncture, a column of Union cavalry appeared on the hills to my left, headed for the broad space between Longstreet's command and mine. In a few minutes that body of Federal cavalry would not only have seized the trains, but cut off all communication between the 2 wings of Lee's army and rendered its capture inevitable. I therefore detached a brigade to double quick and intercept this Federal force. Such was the situation, its phases rapidly shifting and growing more intensely thrilling at each moment, when I received a significant inquiry from General Lee. It was borne by Colonel Charles S. Yenable of his staff, afterward the chairman of the faculty of the University of Virginia. The commander wished me to report at once as to the conditions on my portion of the field, what progress I was making, and what encouragement I could give. I said, "Tell General Lee that my command has been fought to a frazzle, and unless Longstreet can unite in the movement, or prevent these forces from coming upon my rear, I cannot long go forward." Colonel Venable has left on record this statement. At 3 o'clock on the morning of that fatal day, General Lee rode forward, still hoping that we might break through the countless hordes of the enemy who hemmed us in. Halting a short distance in rear of our vanguard, he sent me on to General Gordon to ask him if he could cut through the enemy. I found General Gordon and General Fitz-Lee on their front line in the light of the morning, arranging an attack. Gordon's reply to the message, I give the expressive phrase of the Georgian, was this: "Tell General Lee I have fought my corps to a frazzle, and I fear I can do nothing unless I am heavily supported by Longstreet's corps." Colonel Venable adds that when General Lee received my message, he said, "There is nothing left me but to go and see General Grant, and I had rather die 1,000 deaths. My troops were still fighting, furiously fighting in nearly every direction, when the final note from General Lee reached me. It notified me that there was a flag of truce between General Grant and himself, stopping hostilities, and that I could communicate that fact to the commander of the Union forces in my front. There was no unnecessary delay in sending that message. I called Colonel Green Peyton of my staff and directed him to take a flag of truce and bear the message to General Ord, who commanded, as I supposed, the Union infantry in my front. I ordered him to say to the Union commander this, and nothing more: "General Gordon has received notice from General Lee of a flag of truce, stopping the battle." Colonel Peyton soon informed me that we had no flag of truce. I said, "Well, take your handkerchief and tie that on a stick and go." He felt in his pockets and said, "General, I have no handkerchief." "Then tear your shirt, sir, and tie that to a stick." He looked at his shirt and then at mine and said, "General, I have on a flannel shirt, and I see you have. I don't believe there is a white shirt in the army." "Get something, sir," I ordered. "Get something and go." He secured a rag of some sort and rode rapidly away in search of General Ord. He did not find Ord, but he found Sheridan, and returned to me accompanied by an officer of strikingly picturesque appearance. This Union officer was slender and graceful, and a superb rider. He wore his hair very long, falling almost to his shoulders. Guided by my staff officer, he galloped to where I was sitting on my horse, and with faultless grace and courtesy saluted me with his sabre and said, "I am General Custer, and bear a message to you from General Sheridan. The General desires me to present to you his compliments, and to demand the immediate and unconditional surrender of all the troops under your command." I replied, "You will please, General, return my compliments to General Sheridan, and say to him that I shall not surrender my command. He directs me to say to you, General, if there is any hesitation about your surrender, that he has you surrounded and can annihilate your command in an hour." To this I answered that I was probably as well aware of my situation as was General Sheridan, that I had nothing to add to my message informing him of the contents of the note from General Lee, that if General Sheridan decided to continue the fighting in the face of the flag of truce, the responsibility for the bloodshed would be his and not mine. In a short time thereafter, a white flag was seen approaching. Under it was Philip Sheridan, accompanied by a mounted escort almost as large as one of Fitz-Lee's regiments. Sheridan was mounted on an enormous horse, a very handsome animal. He rode in front of the escort, and an orderly carrying the flag rode beside him. Around me at the time were my faithful sharpshooters, and as General Sheridan and his escort came within easy range of the rifles, a half-witted fellow raised his gun as if to fire. I ordered him to lower his gun and explained that he must not fire on a flag of truce. He did not obey my order cheerfully, but held his rifle in position to be quickly thrown to his shoulder. In fact, he was again in the act of raising his gun to fire at Sheridan, when I caught the gun and said to him with emphasis that he must not shoot men under the flag of truce. He at once protested, "Well, General, let him stay on his own side." I did not tell General Sheridan of his narrow escape. Had he known the facts, that this weak-minded but strong-hearted Confederate private was one of the deadliest of marksmen, he probably would have realized that I had saved his life. Meantime, another member of my staff, Major E. W. Hunter of Virginia, had ridden off with General Custer, who asked to be guided to Longstreet's position. As General Sheridan, with the flag of truce, came nearer, I rode out to meet him. Between General Sheridan and myself occurred another controversy very similar to the one I had had previously with General Custer. No message from General Grant in reference to the truce between the commanders-in-chief had reached General Sheridan. It had miscarried, but upon my exhibiting to him the note from Lee, he at once proposed that the firing cease and that our respective lines be withdrawn to certain positions, while we waited further intelligence from the commanders of the two armies. Our respective staff officers were dispatched to inaugurate this temporary armistice, and Sheridan and I dismounted and sat together on the ground. Quickly the firing was stopped, and silence reigned on the field. But I had forgotten the brigade which I had sent far off to my left to check the movement of Union cavalry, and as General Sheridan and I sat and conversed, a sudden roll of musketry was heard from that quarter. General Sheridan sprang to his feet and fiercely asked, "What does that mean, sir?" I replied, "It is my fault, General. I had forgotten that brigade. But let me stop the firing first, and then I will explain." I called for a member of my staff to ride with all speed to that brigade. None of my staff was there. They had not returned from executing my previous orders. General Sheridan proposed to lend me one of his staff. I accepted the offer, and it so happened that a Union officer, Captain Vanderbilt Allen, bore the last order to my troops, directing them to cease firing, thus practically ending the 4 years of battle for Southern independence. It was necessary, however, to protect Captain Allen from the fire of my men, or from their demand for his surrender. For this purpose, I sent with him as guide and protector one of my ragged privates. That private had belonged to the old Stonewall Brigade. I had never seen General Sheridan before, nor received from those who knew him any definite impressions of him as man or soldier. I had seen something of his work in the latter capacity during the campaigns in the Valley of Virginia. His destruction of barns and mills and farming implements impressed me as in conflict with the laws of war and inconsistent with the enlightened Christian sentiment of the age, and had prepared me in a measure for his somewhat brusque manners. Truth demands that I say of General Sheridan that his style of conversation and general bearing, while never discourteous, were far less agreeable and pleasing than those of any other officer of the Union Army whom it was my fortune to meet. I do not recall a word he said which I could regard as in any degree offensive, but there was an absence of that delicacy and consideration which was exhibited by other Union officers. General Sheridan began the conversation after we had dismounted by saying in substance, "We have met before, I believe, at Winchester and Cedar Creek in the valley." I replied that I was there, and he continued, "I had the pleasure of receiving some artillery from your government, consigned to me through your commander, General Early." He referred, of course, to the piece on which the Confederate wag had painted in white letters the words given in a former chapter. There was nothing offensive in that, but I thought there was in his manner a slight tinge of exultation which was not altogether pleasing, and I replied, "That is true, and I have this morning received from your government artillery consigned to me through General Sheridan." He evidently did not know that within the previous hour we had captured some of his artillery, and he was reluctant to believe it. The meeting of Lee and Grant, and the impressive formalities which followed, put an end to the interview, and we parted without the slightest breach of strict military courtesy. Chapter 30. The End of the War. General Longstreet's forces and mine at Appomattox numbered together less than 8,000 men, but every man able to bear arms was still resolute and ready for battle. There were present 3 times that many enrolled Confederates, but 2/3 of them were so enfeebled by hunger, so wasted by sickness, and so footsore from constant marching that it was difficult for them to keep up with the army. They were wholly unfit for duty. It is important to note this fact as explaining the great difference in the number of those who fought and those who were to be fed. At the final meeting between General Lee and General Grant, rations were ordered by General Grant for 25,000 Confederates. Marked consideration and courtesy were exhibited at Appomattox by the victorious Federals, from the commanding generals to the privates in the ranks. General Meade, who had known General Lee in the old army, paid, after the surrender, an unofficial visit to the Confederate chieftain. After cordial salutations, General Lee said playfully to his former comrade in arms that years were telling upon him. General Meade, who had fought Lee at Gettysburg and in many subsequent battles, made the strikingly gracious and magnanimous answer, "Not years, but General Lee himself has made me grey." Some of the scenes on the field, immediately after the cessation of hostilities and prior to the formal surrender, illustrate the same magnanimous spirit and were peculiarly impressive and thrilling. As my command, in worn-out shoes and ragged uniforms, but with proud mien, moved to the designated point to stack their arms and surrender their cherished battle flags, they challenged the admiration of the brave victors. One of the knightliest soldiers of the Federal Army, General Joshua L. Chamberlain of Maine, who afterward served with distinction as governor of his state, called his troops into line, and as my men marched in front of them, the veterans in blue gave a soldierly salute to those vanquished heroes, a token of respect from Americans to Americans, a final and fitting tribute from Northern to Southern chivalry. General Chamberlain describes this incident in the following words. At the sound of that machine-like snap of arms, General Gordon started, caught in a moment its significance, and instantly assumed the finest attitude of a soldier. He wheeled his horse, facing me, touching him gently with the spur, so that the animal slightly reared, and, as he wheeled, horse and rider made one motion, the horse's head swung down with a graceful bow, and General Gordon dropped his sword point to his toe in salutation. By word of mouth, the general sent back orders to the rear that his own troops take the same position of the manual in the march past as did our line. That was done, and a truly imposing sight was the mutual salutation and farewell. Bayonets were affixed to muskets, arms stacked, and cartridge boxes unslung and hung upon the stacks. Then, slowly and with a reluctance that was appealingly pathetic, the torn and tattered battle flags were either leaned against the stacks or laid upon the ground. The emotion of the conquered soldiery was really sad to witness. Some of the men who had carried and followed those ragged standards through the 4 long years of strife rushed, regardless of all discipline, from the ranks, bent about their old flags, and pressed them to their lips. And it can well be imagined, too, that there was no lack of emotion on our side, but the Union men were held steady in their lines, without the least show of demonstration by word or by motion. There was, though, a twitching of the muscles of their faces, and, be it said, their battle-bronzed cheeks were not altogether dry. Our men felt the import of the occasion, and realized fully how they would have been affected if defeat and surrender had been their lot after such a fearful struggle. When the proud and sensitive sons of Dixie came to a full realization of the truth that the Confederacy was overthrown and their leader had been compelled to surrender his once invincible army, they could no longer control their emotions, and tears ran like water down their shrunken faces. The flags which they still carried were objects of undisguised affection. These Southern banners had gone down before overwhelming numbers, and torn by shells, riddled by bullets, and laden with the powder and smoke of battle, they aroused intense emotion in the men who had so often followed them to victory. Yielding to overpowering sentiment, these high-mettled men began to tear the flags from the staffs and hide them in their bosoms as they wet them with burning tears. The Confederate officers faithfully endeavored to check this exhibition of loyalty and love for the old flags. A great majority of them were duly surrendered, but many were secretly carried by devoted veterans to their homes, and will be cherished forever as honoured heirlooms. There was nothing unnatural or censurable in all this. The Confederates who clung to those pieces of battered bunting knew they would never again wave as martial ensigns above embattled hosts, but they wanted to keep them, just as they wanted to keep the old canteen with a bullet hole through it, or the rusty grey jacket that had been torn by canister. They loved those flags, and will love them forever, as mementos of the unparalleled struggle. They cherish them because they represent the consecration and courage not only of Lee's army, but of all the Southern armies, because they symbolize the bloodshed and the glory of nearly 1,000 battles. Some narrow but very good and patriotic people object to this expression of Southern sentiment. It was not so, however, with William McKinley, that typical American, who, while living and while dying, exhibited in their fullness and strength the virtues of a true and lofty manhood. That chivalric Union soldier, far-seeing statesman and truly great president, saw in this Southern fidelity to past memories the surest pledge of loyalty to future duties. William McKinley fought as bravely as the bravest on the Union side, but he was broad enough to recognize in his Southern countrymen a loyal adherence to the great fundamental truths to which both sides were devoted. He was too wise and too just to doubt the South's fealty to the Constitution or to the doctrines of the Declaration of Independence, for Madison was father of the one and Jefferson of the other. He was great enough to trust implicitly the South's renewed allegiance to the Union and its flag, for hers was the most liberal hand in studding its field with stars. He did not hesitate to trust Southern pluck and patriotism to uphold the honor of the country and give liberty to Cuba. For he remembered Washington and his rebels in the Revolution, Jackson and his Southern volunteers at New Orleans, Zachary Taylor and his Louisianians, Clay and his Kentuckians, Butler and his South Carolinians, and Davis and his Mississippians in Mexico.